Hi, my name's Collin Jarvis and I'm with Stealth Belt Inc. I've had an ostomy since 2014, and in that time I've led an extremely active lifestyle, doing things like running marathons, going on extremely long bike rides, and generally just trying to stay as active as I possibly can. In order to do those things, it was critical for me to learn as much as I possibly could about managing my ostomy, and in particular, how to stay hydrated. In this video, I'm going to talk about why it's so important to stay hydrated when you have an ostomy, and I'm going to share my favorite tips for making sure that that's easier to do. So here we go. As you may already know, water makes up more than 60% of our entire body. And as such, it's involved in every single biochemical reaction that goes on, and that includes absorbing the nutrients and minerals from the foods that we eat. Staying properly hydrated is also really important for maintaining high energy levels, for regulating our body temperatures, and it's even been shown to have a big impact on our overall general well-being and mood. For those of us that have ostomies, it's particularly important to understand how and why to stay hydrated, because compared to the average person, we're often at a deficit when it comes to staying and maintaining proper hydration. The degree to which your hydration will be affected based on your ostomy is going to be a result of what type of surgery you've had. In my case, I have an ileostomy, which means my entire large intestine has been removed. Studies have shown that the large intestine is responsible for about 20 to 30% of all of the body's absorption of liquids that we put into it. So a special note on that 20 to 30% figure that I just mentioned in the video, which I've already filmed, is that's referring to two pieces of information. 10% of our total liquid absorption comes from the actual fluids that we're drinking, but the other 10 to 20% that make up the total 20 to 30% figure that I was just referencing refers to the fluids that are found in foods that we eat that get absorbed once that makes it to the large intestine. So it would follow that I need to make up that 20 to 30% deficit of hydration throughout my day. Being dehydrated can cause a whole host of different problems. Things like dizziness, difficulty thinking clearly, muscle cramping, and a wide range of other negative effects. But for those of us who have ostomies, there are a few other things that we also need to keep in mind. One of these challenges that we often face with ostomies is actually getting blockages. When you're chronically dehydrated, the food that you eat, especially if it's not chewed well enough, is going to have a more difficult time passing through your digestive system and more likely to block up. This can be incredibly painful, and it is absolutely exacerbated by having poor hydration. Another reason those of us with ostomies should be particularly keyed in to why it's important to stay hydrated is because skin health tends to be a big challenge that we face. The skin right around the area of the stoma is often subject to damage from the adhesive and being covered up all day. And the best thing that we can do beyond just using the right appliances is to make sure that we stay hydrated so that our skin can maintain good health or repair itself should it get damaged by any number of different things that can come up with an ostomy. Whether it's general dehydration symptoms, blockages, or skin health issues, dehydration is directly linked to be one of the top 3 reasons that somebody who has an ostomy is readmitted to the hospital. So just that knowledge alone should be enough to make sure that it's something worth paying attention to. So now that we've discussed some of the reasons why it's so important to stay on top of your hydration, especially if you're somebody who has an ostomy, I want to share my 5 favorite tips for how to stay hydrated and keep ahead of all of those possible problems that you might run into. The first tip that I have is to calculate generally how much water or fluids you should be taking in each day. The average recommendation ranges from about 2.5 to 3.5 liters of fluid in total each day. This baseline, of course, is going to vary depending on your body composition, how large you are, how much you weigh, and how active you are. So you can find good resources to get that general baseline to start pretty much anywhere on the internet. Once you've calculated your body's baseline needs for hydration throughout the day, we want to think back to what we talked about with that 20 to 30% deficit that many of us face after having these surgeries. By combining this information, we can estimate that we're going to need roughly about 1 liter more of water throughout our day than the average person will. And so we're going to have to find ways to fit that in. Now that we've determined what we need to be drinking throughout our days, now that we have an ostomy and we're managing our hydration, we need to start building out the routines that are going to make sure that we're able to absorb these fluids effectively. That leads us to tip number 2. Tip number 2 is to make sure that you spread out the fluids that you drink throughout your day as much as you possibly can. And so that means taking lots of small, frequent sips and just making sure that it's as spread out as possible. It's really important to try and spread out your consumption of your fluids throughout the day because our bodies are just not totally efficient at absorbing water. So for instance, if you just had your 3.5 liter jug of water at the beginning of the day and chugged it all, most of that is not going to be able to get absorbed by your body. It's just going to flush right through and you're not going to get hydrated that way. So it's best to spread it out as much as you can. A good way to make sure that you're spreading out your fluids enough throughout the day is to try to make sure that you're drinking before you actually feel thirsty. Much like our body's ability to absorb water, our body is also not perfectly efficient at telling us when it's time to take water in. And so once we start getting those signals that, hey, I'm really thirsty, that actually means that we've started to cross that line into dehydration. So we want to stay ahead of that as much as possible. That being said, I recognize that drinking enough fluid so that you never actually feel thirsty and you're doing that properly is much easier said than done. And so that actually leads us to tip number 3. And tip number 3 is one of my personal favorites, and it's really simple, but it's actually just to get emotionally attached to your water bottle. This is one of my water bottles, and this one's been in my life for probably 6 years now. And I customize it with stickers from places that I've been or fun memories, but I make sure that this water bottle is pretty much a part of me. It goes everywhere that I go, and this is really helpful for 1, reminding me to sip frequently throughout the day, but 2, it also makes sure that I understand how much water I've drank and to meet that requirement from step number 1 when we calculated just how much fluids I need throughout my day. So I would definitely recommend getting a good water bottle, falling in love with it, and making it a part of your daily routine. It's just going to be your little travel companion. And now we can move on to tip number 4. And tip number 4 is to make sure that you do your best to avoid high output triggers. And what do I mean by a high output trigger? That refers to things that you eat or drink that are going to speed up the digestive process and make for more liquidy output. Some common examples of high output triggers in your foods or drinks would be things that are really high in fiber. So things like beans, legumes, nuts, raw vegetables, those types of things. You can eventually integrate them one at a time, but you want to make sure that you chew those super well and that you're staying really hydrated, because those can definitely speed up the process and be a trigger for higher output, which is going to cause more dehydration. Also, drinks with artificial sweeteners or generally just a high degree of sugar in general. And then also drinks with high amounts of caffeine, which, maybe that means limiting your coffee consumption a little bit. I know that's difficult to do. Alcohol is another example of a high output trigger that can just make it more challenging to stay hydrated than it needs to be. So do your best to minimize these things, especially if you're dealing with challenges staying hydrated with your ostomy. Tip number 5 to staying properly hydrated with your ostomy is simply just to use electrolyte supplements. Now, on the topic of staying hydrated, it's probably best that you have a discussion with your primary care doctor or your physician to understand what your needs are, because all of us are going to have slightly different needs. But generally speaking, I can recommend a few things to look for. In your electrolyte supplements, the 3 most important electrolytes that you should look for are sodium, potassium, and magnesium. Now, as far as specific recommendations for electrolyte supplements go, there are a few different categories that I might recommend. One would be what's called the oral rehydration solutions category. And this is a more concentrated kind of medical grade rehydration option. And it's definitely something you'll want to run by your clinician to see if it works for you. But in my case, I've got an ileostomy and I'm very active, which means I sweat a lot. And for those reasons, it makes sense in my daily routine to have something that is more concentrated. And a few different versions of this or companies that make oral rehydration solutions would be SOS, Liquid IV, H2ORS, and there's a whole bunch of other ones out there, but this is definitely worth looking into if you struggle with chronic dehydration or you have an ostomy and you're incredibly active. Another specific type of electrolyte supplement that I might recommend would be kind of the more general grade. So One of the brands that I really like is called GU Energy, that's GU. And they make athletic rehydration solutions that are really low in sugar content, and I think that that just works as well as it can. It's worked very well in my experience, but there are a number of other different options that I'll put up on the screen for you to kind of pick through and see if you want to try a few different options and whatever tastes best. And finally, the other types of electrolytes you can find naturally in a lot of different drinks. Most juices are going to have some electrolytes in them. They're usually kind of high in sugar content, so you might want to limit the amount of juice that you're taking in throughout the day. But I know that sugar-free coconut water is one of the things that I really like. Super high in potassium, a little lower sodium content, and once you start to understand how these affect your hydration, you might want to play with that. But coconut water, a great option. Finally, I know we're talking about electrolytes right now, but I want to just emphasize and not understate the importance of just plain old good fashioned water. Some of your drinks can definitely and should definitely have some electrolyte supplementation, but usually about half of the water I'm drinking throughout the day is just plain water. And sometimes the simplest answers are the most correct. So, talk with your clinician, figure out that balance for you, and, follow the other 4 steps that we talked about, and you should definitely be able to get a better handle on your hydration as a whole. One last caveat I want to add to the electrolyte portion on tip number 5 is there are times and places where high sugar content electrolyte supplementation is good, like things like Gatorade or Powerade. They get kind of a bad rap, and yes, they can be high output triggers, but if you're somebody who is extremely active, or maybe you're an athlete, using these high sugar contents is going to be great mid-exercise. So this is not something you want to sip throughout your day, but I just think it is worth mentioning that if you're somebody who's really active, getting those sugars in while you're actually moving is going to be a fuel source. You'll burn through it, and it won't be as much of a high output trigger if you're actively working out while you're taking in those extra sugars. But again, definitely try to avoid them throughout the rest of your day if you're just kind of casually sipping. And so with that, I'm wrapping up the hydration with an ostomy video. We talked about how and why hydration is so important, and I shared my top 5 favorite tips for helping to maintain regular and consistent hydration throughout your day with an ostomy. And so I hope that you find this helpful. If you feel like there's anything I've missed, or if you want a follow-up video with some more information, please let me know in the comments. I'm more than happy to make more of these. Especially as an athlete who has an ostomy, I'm particularly passionate about making sure that the information is as widely available on how to stay hydrated and just how important it is for us. So let me hear it if there's anything else. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, we'll see you then.